All right, I think we can get started now while waiting for others to join. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. My name is Hao. I'm a manager with RMI, and I will be your host today. Many of you may have already been familiar with our work on emission transparency, and we're super grateful for your support over the past 2 years. In the next 60 minutes, we will dive into how emissions transparency and carbon accounting can drive corporate climate actions with stories from the steel and aluminum industries. A quick reminder, this webinar is being recorded and will be posted on RMI's event page within 24 hours of this event. We will send this recording out to everyone who have registered, along with other resources and contacts. Now let's take a look at today's agenda. So we will begin with a high-level introduction of our work, and this will be followed by a presentation on the carbon accounting pilot outcomes and a panel discussion. You will hear directly from our partners about their experiences leveraging our carbon accounting solutions. During the webinar, please feel free to drop any questions that you have in the Q&A function on the screen. We will address as many as we can during the live Q&A. Finally, we will wrap up by presenting the next phase of our work, how you can get involved, and the quick survey. Next, let me briefly introduce the speakers. Today, I'm joined by my colleague, Nicole, our principal, and our carbon accounting manager, Wenjuan. We're delighted to have representatives from some of RMI's pilot partners, Fernando from Alcoa, a leading aluminum supplier, Ramy from Hydro, another prominent player in the aluminum industry. We have Mo from Oldcastle Infrastructure and Sam from Arup. Both are leaders in the building industry. We also have Nick from Tata Steel, a leading steel supplier. Thank you all again for joining us. Now I will pass it on to Nicole to give a high-level introduction to our work. Nicole, the floor is yours.
Thank you all for joining. Whether you're just starting on your sustainability journey or consider yourself a leader in the space, I think you'll find the lessons learned in this webinar helpful. We believe that in order for companies to understand their supply chain emissions, effectively engage their suppliers, and make climate-friendly purchase decisions, it all starts with having the right information. You need to know what product or supplier is greener than the next. Right now, to get that data, companies typically attempt to collect emissions information from what may be tens of thousands of their suppliers and their suppliers, et cetera. If you can get that data, it's likely reported by the supplier's organizational footprint, and you have to figure out what portion of that your company is responsible for, as well as fill in gaps for suppliers from whom you haven't been able to collect data. Our goal is to fix fundamental challenges by giving companies data that is 1, relevant, 2, comparable, and 3, make it accessible so that they can make better informed, low-carbon purchase decisions. We're enabling the calculation of product-level emissions since your company's supply chain emissions are driven by what you buy, and therefore, this information is highly relevant. We're supportive of using consistent boundaries so that the information is comparable, especially at scale when you have thousands of suppliers whose data you're trying to make sense of. Lastly, we're creating data formats based on our product-level accounting methods so that relevant, comparable data can be seamlessly exchanged between systems and much more widely accessible. And we're doing it alongside key stakeholders. Slide, please. We've been developing our product-level accounting methodologies in lockstep with key industry stakeholders, including nonprofits, industry associations, and influential buyers and suppliers, to ensure that we're meeting the needs and developing robust, usable solutions for these organizations. To date, we've created sector-specific product-level accounting methodologies and data formats in steel and aluminum. This webinar will cover the insights we gained in piloting these solutions with over 10 leading companies and explore pathways for collaboration in our upcoming work. Our guidance and solutions are all free and publicly available. You can find them online on Horizon Zero's website. And now, for more insights on our pilots, Wenjuan.
Thank you, Nicole, and hello, everyone. As Nicole mentioned, in the early of this year, we have published some case studies that covers 5 pilot testing in the both steel and aluminum industry, with automotive and building as a key end-use sectors to test at the product level reporting methodology and the standardized data formats developed by RMI. So in those pilots, if we can go to the next slide. We have worked with upstream partners in both steel and aluminum industry to test the feasibility of the accounting methodology itself. And more importantly, it showcased the value of emissions transparency and various climate metrics that are enabled by the accounting guidance in reflecting their efforts in decarbonization. And by working with the downstream partners, we explored ways to incorporate emissions data into their decarbonization strategy, their target setting, and sustainable procurement practices. Overall, throughout this pilot, we facilitated many constructive conversations between the value chain actors that enabled collaboration. So far, we have only published 4 case studies, with the last one upcoming in near terms. In the next slide, I will go through more details in some of the case studies. So as I mentioned before, not only we test the feasibility of the accounting solution itself, but also explored the various use cases of the guidance to drive the change for both sectors, including what kind of additional metrics or questions to include in supplier survey so that the buyers would be able to get more emissions transparency in the reporting. How to design the embodied carbon specification to inform a low carbon purchase in the building sector. And also questions like what the value added, the improved product level data can play to inform a corporate scope 3 strategies like target setting or internal carbon pricing systems. And how buyers can gain more transparency regarding the supplier's abatement actions by improving thereby they can improve their procurement practices. And on the basis of these use cases, we saw the common desire from both upstream and downstream partners that the standardization and harmonization of the methodology and data exchange is critical. So in the next slide, we would like to share a little bit more details on some of the case studies. In this specific pilot with the building value chain partners, we tested the calculation of for a unitized curtain wall in a hypothetical high-rise residential building in the US to inform the low carbon procurement decisions for building projects. As some of the audience may know, the building value chain is unique as it is often long and sometimes it is fragmented with many construction materials involved. So traditionally, the architectural engineering consulting firm, they often need to collect the product level data to meet the certain low carbon design requirement from the building owner. And in most of these cases, it relies on generic emission factors because it is very hard for them to penetrate those asks to the emission hotspot in the upstream. So in this specific pilots, we enabled a collaborative platform where the direct information can flow between the upstream aluminum producer and the downstream actors. Through this collaborative platform, it greatly helped improve the understanding between them. For example, the upstream can better understand the needs from downstream that are often multiple tiers away from them, so that the upstream suppliers was more incentivized to report and demonstrate their decarbonization efforts through the various reporting metrics enabled by RMI's aluminum guidance. And the downstream buyers can better understand the decarbonization efforts and drivers in the upstream so that they can develop a more targeted specification document to drive the needed change for the industry. Next slide is a example in the steel pilots we conducted. So in this steel pilot, we tested an emissions calculation for a HDP steel coil produced by Tata Steel and explored how the reported data could be used by JLR. So this pilot was designed to target a specific challenge in the industry, which is a lack of standardized data reporting and the complexity of reporting different metrics to different users. Traditionally, steel suppliers often receive various requests from their different buyers, and at the same time, the car manufacturer also can receive different product level data from their suppliers calculated using different methodologies. So without a standardized and harmonized way of reporting, suppliers can be overwhelmed by the reporting burden and the material the buyers can find, and the buyers can find it's very difficult to interpret the received data by the material suppliers. So in this pilot, we worked with Tata Steel to test the feasibility of the reporting guidance with the specific focus on how we can apply the fixed boundary and the various reporting metrics, such as the abatement technology label. And then we explored together with JLR on how we can help them interpret the collected information and the potential to incorporate those information into their current decarbonization practices. Throughout this process, the pilot partners compared the guidance with the current reporting practices in the industry and help us to improve the standards in terms of how it can be more harmonized and standardized with existing efforts. Meanwhile, we worked together with the pilot partners and we identified that the contribution of the steel guidance by RMI is helpful to inform buyers to better understand how the different reporting metrics can help them effectively identify low emission steel from a variety of products supplied. Throughout all of those pilot testing with partners, we learned a lot by working more closely with our pilot partner companies. So there are more details on our website, as Nicole mentioned. Feel free to take a look if you're interested. But for here, I would like to stop my presentation, but give the floor more to our pilot partners here today to share about their experience and some of the lessons they learned. We are delighted to have some of them with us today. So without further ado, I would like to firstly ask all of our panelists here, what were the main lessons learned from the pilot that you think is most helpful to drive product emissions transparency and speeding up decarbonization for both steel and aluminum industry? I would like to give the floor first to Remy from Norsk Hydro to share about his experience.
Yeah.
Remy,
Thank you, Wenjuan. Well, I would say that one major achievement with this project for us was really to base the calculation methodology on primary data, specific data almost exclusively. That was extremely interesting for us to work on that, let's say, trying to avoid using generic data coming from LCA databases to model and to represent our aluminum products within the scope of this project. And so to do so, we needed to get two types of specific data, some data coming from our own operations, but also some data coming from our suppliers. Because a part of the aluminum which has been used for producing the billet and then extruded in the scope of this project was coming from external sources. So about site-specific data, I would say that that wasn't really a challenge for us because we already performed LCAs or EPDs for pretty much all our extrusion plants in hydro. So we already had access to a large amount of data when it comes to energy consumption, to raw materials, to the emission of the processes. So we had a direct control on it, and it was quite straightforward to provide those data, even if the methodologies from our LCAs and from the RMIs was a bit different. When it comes to data coming from our main suppliers, however, it has been a bit more challenging. I would say that this pilot has been a very good opportunity for us to work on, let's say, requesting more reliable, more specific, more precise data to our suppliers to be sure that we will model our products with transparent data and more precisely when we talk about pre-consumer scrap. Because at the moment, in the aluminum industry, there are two distinct approaches when it comes to the assessment of the carbon footprint of aluminum products made of pre-consumer scrap. The first one is to consider pre-consumer scrap as a waste with no burden. And the second one, endorsed by Hydro, is to consider it as a co-product. And thus, there is an associated carbon footprint to the pre-consumer scrap material. And this is essential to know the provenance of the scrap to be able to precisely have an information on the carbon footprint of the scrap. Because some scrap coming from coal-based energy facilities will not have the same carbon footprint than scrap coming from renewable energy. But the problem is that not all the actors in the aluminum industry use both methodologies, which was the case in this pilot. So it has been a great opportunity to extend the collaboration with our suppliers, to ask them data, reliable, specific data about the pre-consumer scrap material. Do you know the origin of the scrap? Do you have a third-party verification associated to this material? That was extremely important, essential for us. And so, yeah, we had this opportunity to go further on the traceability of the pre-consumer scrap material to make our industry progress in the way to decarbonization. So, yeah, I will conclude by saying that this pilot has been extremely helpful to identify first the feasibility of this traceability, but also to identify what will be the main challenges in the near future for that.
Great, thanks, Remy. I do want to echo on your you just talked about primary data and also shared with us about the granularity on scrap. And I really like you mentioned the existing challenge associated with the scrap data and also Hydro's effort on going further to get more supplier-specific data to improve the data transparency and accuracy. Fernando from Alcoa, do you want to share with us some of the experience, the values that from this pilot? You're on mute.
Sorry. Well, thank you a lot for this initiative. And I would like to share three ideas from this project. The first one is the growing need of homogenized carbon footprint data. Decarbonization agendas for companies via science-based targets, net zero, also the access to green funds, certification of buildings have created a need for detailed information of carbon footprint of products and services. So far, many raw material producers, not only within the aluminum industry, are facilitating emission numbers. We find scope 1 and scope 2 numbers, scope 1, 2, and 3 numbers, mine to smelter, environmental product declarations, product carbon footprints, PEF, which implies that whenever carbon footprints are used as factors for purchasing decisions, clarity in the methodology is crucial to prevent unfair competition. And in this line, I think this aluminum guidance developed by the RMI generates an homogenized methodology along the supply chain, which is not only limited to carbon footprint, but also to the types of scrap and the amount of that scrap. The second idea that I would like to share is the transparency along the supply chain is crucial to facilitate the access to primary data in terms of carbon. So I agree with Remy. In this line, this RMI guidance helps to understand how to optimize carbon content in a product from raw material selection. And my last idea is that decarbonization requires taking purchasing decisions. Decarbonization requires taking lots of decisions, like switching to more efficient production processes, more renewable energy content, but it also requires decisions along the supply chain, searching for optimal materials and products in terms of carbon footprint. Mm-hmm. It is important to remark that aluminium can have like an enormous range of carbon footprint. We can talk from more than 20 tons of CO2 equivalent per ton of aluminium if we produce it in high coal-intensive grids, to the range of 4 tons of CO2 equivalent per ton of aluminium when we talk about low-carbon aluminiums, such as, for instance, our well-known Alcoa's Ecolum, which is 1/4 of the global market average. So we believe that these aluminium guidance metrics, post-consumer scrap share, mine-to-smelter emission intensity, will definitely help customers to better understand the drivers behind this variation, this enormous variation in aluminium product emission intensities. Mm-hmm. I would also like to highlight that this project has been a very good example of a joint collaboration between the RMI and private companies such as Alcoa, trying to help other companies downstream raw material production to simplify the calculation of carbon footprint. Alcoa has helped in this project, or in this calculation tool, to try to validate it with our own values from LCA, with primary data. Also, we believe that this tool, together with a homogenized data transfer system, will save a lot of resources and time to companies willing to calculate carbon footprint without the need of a full LCA with a specific software, specific databases, and willing to decarbonize their portfolio. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fernando. I heard your words. I really appreciate that you mentioned our work as a joint effort to improve the transparency and some of the use cases you mentioned for the needs of more detailed data, and how those detailed data can inform the better understanding on the downstream on the needs and the drivers in the upstream to reduce emissions. And I personally very much appreciate all the efforts Alcoa has been put in helping us developing the tool and also improving the tool so that it can save the reporting efforts and time and resources, especially for the companies who do not have enough knowledge or resources to develop EPDs or a list of other full set of LCAs. So let's shift the focus to the steel industry. Nick, do you want to share with us some of your 2 cents on the pilots from a steel industry's perspective?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Ren. So, in thinking about some of the things we've already heard about in the aluminium sector, there's certainly some analogies in terms of how we've used LCA data in the past and created LCA models for our products. In fact, in Tata Steel, we've been involved in the area of product level carbon accounting and LCAs for over 20 years. And really in that time, I've rapidly seen a growing interest in the topic. And evolution of standards is just a growing and exploding area that, is in a sense a good thing, but we recognize that there's a need for, whilst these standards do develop and grow, there's certainly a need for harmonization, and I think RMI and Tata Steel and other members of the pilots would recognize that as well. And in fact, we recently joined the Steels, became a signatory to the Steel Standards Principles that was launched at COP28, and that's part of our advocacy around common emissions measurement and methodologies for doing that. So yeah, we work in the interests of carbon harmonization. We work closely with organizations such as the World Steel Association, and use that as a kind of basis for how we calculate carbon footprints and LCAs for our products. And we're then very, very pleased to be invited by RMI to participate in one of the pilots, which we undertook with JLR, one of our customers. So if I talk a little bit about the pilot, more specifically about what we did, we looked at one of the products we supply to JLR, which is hot dip galvanized coil, and undertook some testing of the RMI steel guidance in the context of that product that we supply. So the issues that we talked about and explored through that pilot enabled us to consider topics such as allocation of emissions. So that's to the various products that we make, hot dip galvanized coil being one of those, but also to some of those co-products that we produce through our processes. So things like blast furnace slag or other byproducts that we produce. We also talked about relevant metrics. So JLR and ourselves both recognized that when it came to emissions level reporting, one measure could be the share of primary data. So as well as declaring a carbon intensity, it would be useful to have some sort of visibility of the share of primary data. So that was something that we learned through that kind of whole sharing and learning process. And I think another key point is that through collaboration, it's not just about sharing the data and the data points as well. It's also about understanding the steel manufacturing processes, but also the needs of JLR and their processes for assessing and building their own kind of targets and objectives for decarbonisation. In terms of kind of best practices, we both partners, I think, recognize the value of verification. So once we had undertaken the calculations and calculated the data, the next step would definitely be around a verification to ensure the kind of reliability of the data, as well as just having the data in its own right. And finally, I think a point I would make more generally is that, when it comes to product level carbon accounting, I think through the explosion and interest in the field, there's clearly a lack of kind of knowledge, maybe lost knowledge and skills. It's a growing area and field it's in its own right. And so we see that as another critical element to facilitating this whole discussion about transfer of data in the supply chain and having a good understanding of what that should be and how we make that a robust and reliable process. So yeah, that concludes kind of my observations.
Thank you, Nick. I do like your emphasis on the need for harmonization and standardization of the methodologies. And you have been mentioning the growing interest in the area and also, the exploding efforts in making standards or developing methodologies. I think that is not only for the steel sector, but it is true for all of other sectors as well. We have been seeing the similar trend. For the downstream, we also have Arab and Oldcastle with us today, and they're from the building industry. And I would like to give the floor to both of them. Maybe Mo, do you want to start from your perspective with Oldcastle? What are some of the main lessons and experience that you want to share with this cohort?
Sure. Thank you for the chance and the opportunity. I would like to thank everybody who made this pilot possible, and from RMI side or from the industry partners as well. For me personally, this whole journey has been a learning process. I am not from a sustainability background at all, so this was my first experience with this, and it shows that it's an accessible thing that everybody and all the companies should start partaking in it and building the knowledge and building the necessary people to drive sustainability forward to next point. And so for us as OBE, we are a fenestration manufacturer. So what we do is we build windows and doors. And as you guys know, it's a very intensive, aluminum intensive product, and obviously a very vital component in buildings. And it can be responsible for quite a bit of the carbon emissions that goes into a building, especially the embodied carbon, but not only the embodied carbon, the operational carbon as well. For the people who are not familiar with those terms, the embodied carbon is the carbon that it takes to create a product. and the operational carbon is the carbon that it takes to use or run the product. So for us being a fenestration manufacturer, we are kind of in the middle of a chain value where we are the link between our aluminum supplier and the raw materials and the final product that ends up going into the building. And so that gives us a huge responsibility of making sure that we are using and working with the right suppliers, using a clean aluminum, sustainable aluminum, and then finally turning the aluminum into a product that will satisfy the needs of our clients. So with that being said, this is exactly what this pilot helped us with, is establishing a line of communication between ourselves and our suppliers and our clients, either being individual clients or architectural firms. And we get these demands from the clients or the architectural firms, and we have to work with them to be sure and make sure here is what's possible, here are the numbers that we can meet, and then go back and work with our suppliers as well. Make sure that they are using a good amount of recycled aluminum and using clean energy, so that we make sure that from upstream to downstream, we get a good cohesive flow, and finally being able to deliver what's needed. So yeah, that's exactly what this pilot helped us with, is establishing that communication line and being transparent with our suppliers, which sometimes it's difficult to do, as a lot of suppliers just simply don't have the data, or they were not asked to provide data before. They were not subjected to provide a low enough GWP number, and so that falls on our responsibility. And when we are doing our aluminum procurement, we have to make those tough decisions and choose if we have to keep working with this supplier or change the supplier. And so that's what this pilot made us realize.
Great, thanks, Mo. I really like your shared more details in terms of how the building industry works with data and also works with collecting GWP, which is, to the broader audience, is a carbon emissions at product level with the suppliers. And I also do like your mentioned experience that enable Oldcastle to be able to work more closely with upstream and downstream, and also the challenge you just shared, when the data is not in place, the decision on procurement can be very challenging. Yeah, so to our last speaker, Sam from Arab, as an engineering architectural consulting firm, what are some of the lessons learned and experience that you want to share?
Thanks, Rendran. So my background is in facade engineering, and recently I've been taking part in some whole life cycle analysis. So I have some understanding of both the operational and embodied carbon related design process. And I can say in the last 2 to 3 years, we've been getting a lot more pressure from clients and architects to increase our standard for low carbon building materials. There have been corporate ESG goals. Now LEED v5 is in review, and they're incorporating more points for life cycle analysis and embodied carbon reduction. There's the International Living Future Institute standard, which has been pushing for embodied carbon reduction in its carbon leaf. Buy Clean Acts in Boston. And some of our more ambitious clients have set goals as ambitious as decarbonization by 2028. So the main takeaway is that we need to achieve this decarbonization in every building material supply chain in order to achieve the kind of goals that the top end of the building industry is requiring. And and this is kind of daunting for someone in a design position who's dealing with many different materials and certainly doesn't have the same expertise as someone so deeply embedded in the aluminum industry. Which is why I think the specification that we worked on developing in this research group is so important. For one, just going the extra mile and requesting an EPD from a manufacturer shows manufacturers that don't have data available how important it is in order to compete on the market to make that data available to designers. And then being able to specify a carbon intensity for low carbon aluminum that we understand is both achievable by the industry and relatively higher performing than a conventional product allows us to confidently say that we're achieving sensible carbon reductions without having to have this deep understanding of the aluminum industry and avoiding a situation where the cost of carbon reduction which would be the cost difference between a low carbon and a conventional product, makes the client actually reconsider their sustainability goals entirely. So I think it's very important for us to set these sensible targets and allow the industry an opportunity to understand this new variable in the process. And then I think the transparency also really helps us avoid some potential greenwashing and carbon reduction tactics that don't actually correlate with sensible carbon reduction in the industry, but as some of other speakers have mentioned, might be related to accounting or misrepresenting some externalities. So overall, I think this is a really great study, and we need this kind of vertically integrated research and action in every building material industry that we touch on. So thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Sam. When you mention how everything unfold from a engineering architecture firm for the building industry and the specification that the team has been co-developing through this pilot is definitely something we think going to be very helpful and is a valuable experience. And also, I really like you mentioned that, you know, how everything can be complex in the decision making when we talk about a whole building, and also the importance of setting more sensible targets and having those kind of more targeted specification that their role in driving the industry decarbonization and the change that will be enabled. The next question I have for all the speakers, which I would like to use that as a concluding remark for this cohort. So maybe in one sentence or one short sentence, what do you think is the most needed to improve emissions transparency and drive changes for industry decarbonization? It can be one sentence or just a couple of words that you want the audience to take away from this panel discussion. Maybe Mo from Ocaso, do you want to start?
Sure. So one thing that I came across, well, if you want just one phrase, it's gonna be standardization of units. And if in more of a couple of words, I will say I came across different units dealing with EPDs and just in reporting sustainability numbers. And I just think if everybody agrees on one unit, so when you look at the number, you can just by looking at it tell if it's right or wrong. Is it reasonable? Are we able to achieve that, or is it just a completely random number? And when I say units, specifically in the fenestration or facade industry, people like to ask for kilograms CO2 per meter square, which I understand because you're dealing with areas of facade of buildings, but that can be a very misleading unit as the fenestration is very configurable, and in the same area, using the same product, you can have two different carbon intensities. And so just addressing that and agreeing on one unit that will that will increase the transparency and make just get rid of confusion.
Thanks, Mo. Yeah, harmonization is definitely one thing. And I do believe there might be someone else from the panel want to talk about harmonization as well. So maybe, Remy, do you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mentioned it before, but currently in the aluminum industry, there are two distinct approaches when it comes to the assessment of the carbon footprint or the environmental performance of aluminum products. And of course, those two methods are completely opposite and not compatible. And having two methods currently, it can lead to double accounting or even worse, to the omission of some greenhouse gas emission along the value chain. And due to that, our industry may be perceived as lacking of transparency, of accuracy, of reliability, maybe. So to answer to your question, I would say that the harmonization of the calculation methodology is, in my opinion, the first and the biggest step to be achieved to progress in the decarbonization of the aluminum industry.
Thanks, Remy, definitely. Nick, do you want to share something else from a different perspective, maybe?
Yes, so I think, you know, I mentioned about skills and knowledge. I see that as a real area. If you think about financial accounting, the amount of knowledge and expertise and chartership and all the rest of it that you have in that area, when it comes to and really kind of think about how we become I guess, professional carbon accountants, so that we can provide data that is reliable and can kind of converse in different units and translate data in a meaningful format. So yeah, for me, I think that's one real opportunity and critical aspect of this this whole jigsaw puzzle.
Thanks, Nick. Sam, do you want to share some perspective?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think that the previous points that the speakers made were really great, but I would also say that on the behalf of designers, we need more experience with what are the most carbon intensive components in our buildings, what portions of the supply chain can we target in order for carbon reduction. And I think a takeaway from this study is that aluminum is both a highly carbon intensive component of buildings that we design and something that we can target for sensible carbon reduction. More of that and less of these like unproven solutions that market sustainability did.
Thanks, Sam. Fernando, the floor is
Well,
yours.
yeah, three things. First one, like harmonization, like need of a common and transparent methodology for carbon footprint calculation. I fully recall this point. The second point would be data sharing, more transparency in the supply chain. And the third one would be the vertical collaboration along the supply chain players, from raw material producers to final product manufacturers.
Great. I love that. Thanks, Fernando. Definitely, industry decarbonization needs more transparency, I think, from this panel discussion and the pilot process. We have been proving this. And many elements mentioned by our panelists are like harmonization, which has been frequently mentioned and recalled, and knowledge sharing, as Nick has been mentioned as well, downstream support and vertical collaboration, data transferring, and also some of the decarbonization levers and perspectives mentioned by other panelists as well. I think those are all the set of conditions that would enable the needed change in both steel and aluminum industry. And finally, I would like to say thanks to our speakers who worked closely with RMI on the pilot testing and also share the experience they have with us here today. We look forward to continuing the journey with more partners to drive change for the hard-to-abate industry. And without further ado, I would like to hand the floor over back to Hao so that we can start our Q&A sessions with the broader audience.
Thank you so much, Wenjuan, and all the panelists for the valuable insights from the pilot. We have received some great questions, but due to the time limit, we will only be able to address the most frequently asked one live right now. However, rest assured, we will try our best to reach out and respond to all the remaining questions after the webinar. And if you don't hear from us, please don't hesitate to reach out via email provided on the last page of our slides. And thank you for your understanding. So the most frequently asked question by our audience is, how is RMI's methodology relate to other existing efforts and methodologies? And maybe I can start at the very high level, and I welcome all the panelists and my colleagues to add to it. As we flagged before, Horizon Zero really aims to play a complementary role to the existing standards and methodologies instead of creating new accounting methods. For example, WBCSD Pact Pathfinder framework has created general guidelines for product level emissions reporting and data formats. But RMI has created sector-specific and product-level accounting methods and the corresponding data formats and extensions in different sectors. And this is very crucial for the standard implementation. And then for sector-specific guidance created by industry associations, such as we know that IAI has been mentioned, and World Steel, Responsible Steel, Horizon Zero expands that effort by providing more granular data details. We are asking for additional metrics for the sake of transparency and comparability between products. For example, I think some of the partners have mentioned the request for primary data share, additional transparency on recycled content, etc. Some have also mentioned the difference between us and EPD, and I won't go into details. We can provide overview after this webinar. The two methodologies have differences in system boundary, the reporting metrics, but we see that we are playing a complementary role, as I said before, by asking additional metrics for additional transparency in this industry. But happy for all the panelists and my colleagues to add on to this answer. Anybody would like to add?
I can quickly add on that comparison with EPD. As Hao mentioned, I just want to echo that we do see ourselves playing a complementary role to EPDs. And I believe many of the audience may know that EPD can take a lot of efforts and resources within a company to complete the whole journey of the EPDs. And it takes much longer term to go through all the process. And companies often find it is challenging to do EPDs for all the products within their facility and their different level of climate maturity across the sets, production sets within a company. So we do see our methodology and also the calculation tool provided or used together with our guidance can play a role to help companies to get those calculations in an accurate and consistent way, in an easier format and easier way, so that it would be able to reduce the burdens on the supplier side to have those product level data calculated without going through the burden to create EPD for all of the products. So we do see our work playing a complementary role and enabling some of other metrics that are not included in the EPD system, but we do agree with the value and we are happy to see the momentum gained in the EPD world as well. So yeah, I think in general, if there is just like one takeaway, I think we are playing a complementary role and trying to reduce the burden on the supplier side. Just want to see if there is any speakers want to add anything.
Yeah, absolutely. Like like in the way EPDs are performed, like it is require a lot of experience and a lot of resources in order to cover the life cycle assessment that is required as first step, the verification of this LCA and the publish of the EPD. So it requires resources and time to get it. However, with this tool, we simplify the process in a significant way. So we can pass from taking months of work to taking weeks of time to perform calculations. So it saves a lot of time and resources. Besides EPDs cover other environmental indicators, and also EPDs are performed based on many different product category rules, which are specific rules for families of products. So even EPDs are not consistent, one EPD versus other EPD. You need to do APDs with the same methodology. So this tool brings homogenization for all aluminum products that are performed with the tool, which is a really good deliverable from the project.
Perfect. Thank you, Wenjuan. Thank you, Fernando, so much for the answer. For the sake of time, we need to move on to the next agenda item. Thanks again for all the panelists and my colleague, Wenjuan. We have some other questions related with next phase of activities and collaboration opportunities, which Nicole will cover in a second. Floor is yours, Nicole.
Thank you. Yes, our work doesn't stop here. We all know there are still challenges that need to be addressed, and we're using the lessons learned from the pilots and continuous stakeholder engagement to inform our next phase of work. Slide, please. We've identified two main focus areas, enabling buyers to strengthen demand signals and helping suppliers better understand and report on their emissions. Overall, we know that carbon accounting can be time intensive and require a baseline level of technical knowledge. And so we aim to make these activities as efficient as they are effective and fill in the knowledge gaps that still remain. So taking each of these in turn, next slide, please. To support buyers in using our solutions and address emission hotspots, we're creating a buyer's handbook that will cover topics such as practical how-to implementation guides on improving the quality of your greenhouse gas footprint and target using supplier-specific data, applying the data to greenhouse gas reduction actions such as procurement policies, and wrapping up those actions in internal capabilities, regardless of your level of climate maturity. Slide, please. And at the same time, our goal is to minimize barriers for suppliers by educating them on how to measure and report their emissions. We realize that this is a labor-intensive process, and we want to enable greater emissions visibility across the value chain by making things easier rather than more complicated. The supplier-specific data supports suppliers in understanding and reducing their emissions while helping downstream buyers reduce their upstream emissions. The more companies implement these accounting methodologies and data formats, the more efficient it is to collect and transmit data, and the more accurate the data are for targeted, effective decision-making and decarbonization action. So there is an advantage at scale, and we'd love to work with you to achieve it. Slide, please. There are several ways to engage with us. A quick survey to provide feedback, which I'll cover next. We're looking for more companies to implement these solutions, both on the buyer and supplier side, ideally those that work with one another. And if you are a buyer, please engage your suppliers to participate in our supplier training. Slide, please. So please feel free to reach out to any member of the team. Thank you so much for joining us for this webinar. We're thrilled to share this important work with you. We've been recording this session, and the slides and recording will be posted on the event page within 24 hours. It's the same webpage that you used to register for the webinar, and it's also linked through the QR code on the screen. This is the end of the presentation portion of the webinar, but we would love to hear your input on the next phase of work. Please feel free to hang around. We'll provide the link to the survey and keep things lively with some jazzy music to give you some time right now while the webinar content is still fresh. So thank you and have a wonderful day. And Yes, for those of you who are still here for the survey, we'll share links in the chat. You can also access the survey through the phone using the QR code in the slide deck. The buyer survey is more recommended for manufacturers that use steel and aluminum raw materials and downstream companies purchasing steel and aluminum goods. The supplier survey recommended for primary steel and aluminum producers, steel and aluminum scrap recyclers, and semi-fabricators. But you're not necessarily limited to those descriptions, and we're keen to hear a broader scope of input. So with that, we'll give you some time to fill out the survey. Thank you.